I really enjoyed that talk, Darcy, so thank you very much. And it actually sets things up perfectly for what I want to talk about. So Darcy making reference to things like QR codes, containers covered in sensors, the lobster in Shanghai. I can't talk too much about the lobster, but certainly the beef in Shanghai I can talk about. And the use of smart contracts. These are all things that I really want to cover today. So thank you for having me along, even though I was part of organising it, so thanking myself in a way. I think this is a really interesting collection of ideas that we're talking about today, and so I'm excited to be a part of it. So my presentation, it's actually a collection of ideas, predominantly from a project that I've been involved in since December of last year, the Beef Ledger project, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's also, this presentation also brings in several months of reading about food fraud, which is one of my topics of interest, personal topics of interest as well as professional. And I've also had a bit of a blockchain interest for the past 2 years. And so I'm really at the early stages of considering how some of these issues work together. So if some of the ideas don't appear to be completely formulated, there may be a reason for that, but I'll see if I can fool you as I go along. So a couple of things. I'm not going to explore any issues to do with the World Trade Organization or trade in that sense, even though that is one of the topics that I'm particularly interested in. I only wanted to cover a few things today without going into too many areas, and potentially I've done that anyway. So I'll try and keep it reasonably simple as I move through, because I think that talking about something like blockchain is probably complicated enough. Well, it is for me anyway. So I mentioned, so the background for this presentation is mostly associated with the Beef Ledger project that I'm very pleased to say that I've been involved with since December. It's a really interesting project, it's a great team. So yes, I've been working on it for quite a few months, but we are at the early stages of that research. It's a 2-year project, it's funded by Food Agility, and it precisely covers one of the use cases that Darcy was talking about in his presentation, so thank you very much, about the supply chain and tracing through the supply chain. So Beef Ledger is an application that uses data drawing from the Internet of Things with transactions that are verified by blockchain. And the idea is that this application will trace basically the life cycle of beef from the feedlot through to the consumption. And we're particularly interested, I don't know if you can quite see it because it's covered up in the slide, but that's the skyline of Shanghai. So we're particularly interested in exporting to China and the process with exporting to China and how this will all work. That picture, I actually took that picture in Shanghai in a cold storage room, and I can tell you those coats were very necessary. It was completely freezing in there, and it was even cold in Shanghai. But when we left the cold storage area, it's like, oh, it's tropical again, because you'd acclimatise to the cold storage. So as I've mentioned, we're at the early stages, but this was a picture taken from the first shipment of the beef. And there has been a second shipment since then. It starts with the cattle in Mount Gambier and ends with importation into China. So some of the goals of the project, other than, it's more than just tracking the data and more than just tracking the information. It's about feeding data backwards through the supply chain as well. So sometimes suppliers want to know where their product has ended up. Also about executing a payment system using a blockchain application, and also about how to incentivise good behaviour. And I'm going to talk about why that's necessary in just a second. So just by way of background, so Darcy mentioned QR codes. And I think of what we're doing with introducing these sorts of things in the supply chain is a little disruptive in and of itself, because the background to this picture, you can't see it, but it was completely manic in this cold storage. There were forklifts going everywhere, as you can imagine. People were extremely busy, lots of things happening, because things have to happen at such a scale. This is just to get things physically from A to B. And that's really the big concern at the moment. So when we're throwing in what some would consider to be a level of administration, that is disruptive, and there's a question of, well, how is that going to happen? I don't know if you can see it in the picture. I keep pointing to the one in front of me. I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but that's the box that has all of these different security points on it. Actually, physically scanning each and every box is something that you can't necessarily implement. And so it's a matter of working with the technology that's available at the moment and considering where that technology is going. So those are some of the challenges. So I'm going to step away from talking about that project for just a second to talk about the problems that we're trying to solve here. So maybe some people think, when they think about blockchain, well, why do we care about blockchain? Why do we need it? What are some of the problems associated with it? So, of course, being involved in the Beef Ledger project and being personally obsessed with food and food fraud, that's where I'm going to start. So, stepping back for just a second, one of the big challenges facing the planet is, how are we going to feed this future population of 9 billion people? And of course, it's not going to be capped at 9 billion people, but that's where it's heading very, very quickly. It's reported that more than 1 in 7 people today still do not have access to sufficient protein and energy from their diet, and even more suffer from some form of micronutrient malnourishment. So coupled with these challenges are new changes associated with something that's referred to as the food revolution. Now, this is usually a phrase used in reference to developing countries where it's reported that the demand for meat is increasing by 5 to 6% each year, and dairy and milk products the demand for dairy and milk products are increasing by a significant percentage each year also. And when you think about the way the population is growing in developing countries and you extrapolate this out, it's quite a significant increase in demand. So this means there's an increasing in demand for resource-intensive food products. So to me, what does this mean? This means that we will have to do things we haven't done in the past. Perhaps we'll have to eat things that we haven't eaten before, and certain things are going to have to change in terms of the production. And this is going to bring about things that Darcy mentioned, about differential price points in particular, because some people aren't going to be willing to do that, but they will be willing to pay more for their products. But they will want to know that what they're buying is what they're actually being sold. Which brings me to this problem of food fraud, because what we're buying is not necessarily what we're being sold in all instances. So with this increasing demand for something, often this brings about many opportunities, now both good and bad. But I'm going to focus on the bad, the fraud. Okay, so the demand for high quality food, the ability and the willingness to pay more for food opens up this possibility of food fraud and capricious acting. It's a significant incentive. So it's not necessarily linked to the amount of food that is required, but if you start differentiating between price points, then certainly you're going to see opportunities for financial gain that may not have existed elsewhere. So before I consider that further, I just thought I would define what I mean by food fraud, because this covers all types of things. So it's a type of food crime, a crime associated with food. It's obviously not something that is allowed within the scope of the law. It means that food is being sold in a way that deliberately misleads or deceives consumers, and this is done with the purpose of financial gain. I've got another quote up there on the slide. I found this to be quite a useful definition. It's a collective term used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, food ingredients, or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. And then I've just gone through and extrapolated what some of those examples actually are. This is like substitution, and something I've been reading about in a book that I'm reading at the moment is the horse meat replacement that occurred in 2013. So that would obviously be a type of food fraud. Other things is changing use-by dates. Apparently this occurs very, very frequently. Ingredients in processed foods that we have not been told about, all done deliberately and is misleading. So we're not told about this, and it's done so that they can charge us more for these products. Okay, so I've got a few more examples up there on the slide. So this sort of is looking at the problem in China, and it's certainly a major concern in China when you start speaking to some of the people over there. They don't necessarily trust what they're told about their food, and they definitely want to. It's one of their big concerns about food is where does it come from, and can I trust that that's actually true? Now, we can sort of segregate ourselves from this and say, well, it's a problem in these developing economies, where there's this huge demand for food, where there's a massive population. But I can assure you that it's not a problem that we are immune from in Australia. I've spoken to companies who say this is a significant problem here. We're probably all aware of issues with seafood labelling, for instance. And I've spoken to seafood experts who say this is done so frequently that we may think we know what a fish looks like, but it's actually been mislabelled so frequently that that's not actually what it does look like. Also to meat distributors who tell me that they believe that probably 50% of the products that are being sold, even high-end products, are being misrepresented. And this means that it's difficult for anybody who doesn't want to behave in this manner to actually compete on this level, because it brings down the price of these products, and people think that it's all the same quality when actually it's not. So for developing economies, it does appear to be substantially greater than it is for developed. And so it's certainly a problem over in China, which is why the Beef Ledger project has focused its attentions over there. Okay, so I wanted to introduce a couple of other issues along with food fraud, and I better move through these reasonably quickly. So fraud, to me, it's a big problem in and of itself, but another problem that's also a personal concern of mine is animal welfare, because we have a lot of animal products as a part of our food supply chain. And so animal welfare linked in with food fraud, I thought, well, potentially that can be an issue that we can look at together. And it's certainly something that we're looking at as an issue together in the Beef Ledger project, because obviously it's very important. So mislabelling of certain products, such as the egg controversy that I'm sure we're all aware of that, this free-range egg controversy and what that actually means. So that's a type of food fraud, for instance. And a lot of these were done within the scope of the law, so maybe not considered to be a crime in particular instances, but it challenged our opinions on what free range actually is. And what this potentially can do is mean that conscious consumers who want to buy products that have certain qualities may stop actually doing that because they feel like they're being lied to. So they're spending this extra money and they're basically assisting the fraudsters or the people who are basically not treating the animals any better than they should be. So this fraud issue can intersect with animal welfare. So in the project that I'm working on, we're also looking at transportation as a key issue in the supply chain and looking at how the actual transportation, the physical transportation, can have an impact on the animal welfare, and what this means in terms of the outcomes associated with the animal's well-being, and actually tracking the way the animal is transported, driver behaviour and various sorts of things can have a significant impact on animal well-being. And there are ways to track this, such as through devices referred to as smart ear tags, for instance. We haven't actually used the smart ear tags at this point, but they do have the ability to measure heart rates of the animal, and so that's data that could potentially be available in the future. So you can link in the speed of the vehicle, particular behaviours of the driver and various other things, and link that in with the welfare of the animal and show how one will affect the other. Which also brings me to the issue of waste. So I was trying to make this a triangular issue of my core interests, but also bringing in the Beef Ledger project. So linking in the issue of waste, obviously this is a huge issue when we're talking about feeding people at such a scale of 9 billion people. So when I think about food chains, the improvement of food chains and data, I think about, well, how can this be done with a way of reducing waste? So I've noted on the slide that there's 3 issues to be considered here. So the demand for quality, this can mean that where products don't meet that quality, even when they are edible, can potentially be wasted. Another issue here is that some animals are potentially destroyed because they could potentially contain disease, or could potentially be carrying diseases that has no threat to human health. And now some people may say, you know what, I'm okay with that, but other people would say, well, I'm quite happy to consume a product that's not going to be of any harm to me. And linking back to the problem of food fraud, we've probably all done it anyway, because even though there are those regulations out there, not everybody's behaving in the way that they should be. And then, of course, there's the transportation issue that I've just mentioned. So if driver behaviour is not as it should be, then potentially we could see things like unnecessary deaths in the transportation stage. And obviously there's a lot of steps involved in the transportation stage. So unnecessary deaths, there's also bruising, there's waste of end product. Now this could have an economic loss for the producers, can involve food waste, of course, and also increase animal suffering. And obviously all of those things are not good things. I'm probably going to have to skip over this because I'm running low on time already. Oh, man. I'm going to skip over this. I kind of just introduced it because I'm fascinated by it. But basically, when we were talking about waste and diseases, obviously nobody wants to eat any product that's associated with mad cow disease, but this happened in 1986, and perhaps this has had some leftover effects that we're now destroying products that don't necessarily need to. So that's a shame. I was excited to talk about that. I also probably don't need to talk as much about information asymmetry because Darcy's covered that really well. But obviously information asymmetry, basically, it's experienced a lot in commercial transactions. And as consumers, we're often at the point where we're lacking the information that other people in the supply chain actually have. And we're basing our decisions on information that other people have and trusting what they're telling us, which as a consumer, I usually trust what I'm told on food labels, for instance. I trust what restaurants tell me. But the more and more I read about this, I feel really naive, and perhaps it's not something I will continue to do, unless, of course, more data is available. So conscious consumerism, for example, that's something that I try to do, but again, can we actually trust what we're paying for? And so it's one of the concerns. So the supply chain dilemma, it's not only animal products, it's a concern. It's probably a lot of different supply chains that we are faced with this problem. Even things like the clothing that we buy, can we trust that it's sustainable even when we're told that it is? And so this is one of the big issues. So I better skip forward and move on to what I'm actually here to talk about, which is a bit about blockchain technology. So we can consider the issue of regulation versus technology. So if we have a problem, so a lot of us are lawyers, we have a problem, how do we fix it? Let's use regulation. But is there another option? Will the technology do this? Where regulation has obviously failed in some aspects in the example that I've just given. Because even though we can bring in regulation, I was going to talk through some of the regulation involved in the beef supply chain. It obviously doesn't fix all capricious behaviour, and this is because we have this problem of standards and enforcement. So I was going to talk a bit about what Beef Ledger actually does. It's an integrated provenance, blockchain security and payments platform. It's a general purpose technology platform project utilising blockchain technologies that seeks to harness a diverse range of product provenance information as a basis of improved payments and confidence among supply chain participants. And why are we interested in this? It's because the beef supply chain is particularly complex. There are many families, there's many businesses and communities that depend on the sustainability of the beef supply chain, and a lot of the products are actually exported. And so it's really important that we're able to verify where it's been and the standards of it, because Brand Australia really does depend on this. And certainly when you go over to China, I don't know anybody who's been there recently, perhaps Darcy, you've been over to Shanghai recently. Certainly Brand Australia seems to be something that does attract a bit of a pricing premium. So, am I out of time? Okay. Okay, right. That's very subtle, Ros. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk through some of the different regulations associated with the beef supply chain. So first of all, the National Livestock Identification System. How much can I do in a minute? So this is, we're talking from pretty much from birth, but really the first movement of the animal through to the point where it's being processed. The National Livestock Identification System is relevant. Now, this usually involves a paper-based record. There is now an electronic version. I don't know how good the electronic version is, but I'm pretty certain that the paper is not always filled in as it's intended to be. And so it's a very important part of the beef supply chain in Australia, because the safety of the product, biosecurity of the product, all those sorts of things are crucial. And at the moment, it's not necessarily being utilised as it's intended to be. So we've also got other regulations involved in the transport and the processing. So transport, there's standards and there's laws in most states to do with the transport of live animals, not only on the land, but that's one we're particularly interested in. There's also processing requirements, licensing of premises, and this is without even talking about export at this stage. Exports, again, then we're talking more regulations associated with export markets just from the Australia side, and then when you start looking at the country that you're exporting into, there's more regulations there. So what I'm saying is, in this minute that I've got, there's an awful lot of law there, and it doesn't seem to be solving a lot of these big problems. Hence this blockchain-based system that I've been talking about. I was also going to give a couple of other examples of other applications that are using this type of system, but I'm going to skip through that. I wanted to mention about the Internet of Things, because this is a big use case for blockchain, is the Internet of Things. And maybe, Darcy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been doing a lot of reading about it, and it seems like these two things are intricately connected on the basis of two things, which is the privacy and security associated with the data. So hopefully everybody knows what the Internet of Things is, otherwise it's up on the slide because I don't have time to talk about it. I just did want to skip through to my last slide then. I was going to talk a bit about blockchain advantages.
That just won't give me time for questions, but there's always lunch.
I'll be here at lunch too, if you're
okay.
here at lunch. So if you
yeah, absolutely. But we do have another session coming up, so I'm just conscious of that. So I just wanted to address some of my problems that I had mentioned and how blockchain could potentially assist this. And when I say blockchain, I'm talking about data that's been verified through the blockchain using the Internet of Things, of course. So waste potentially provide details of the exact connection of the end products with its shortcomings. And this could lead to price differentials, as Darcy mentioned. Some people will not want to pay for something that's lesser quality, but some people will be willing to pay a lot more for things, but they want to know that it's verified. And hopefully this is something that they can rely on, more so than they can just the value of somebody's word, because obviously we can't always rely on that. Animal welfare, this is something that's being explored in detail in the Beef Ledger project by my colleagues in the business school, Uwe Dulek and his master's student Ramon. They're looking at whether animal welfare can be improved through transportation, whether improvements in that transportation can result in less pain or stress for the animal, and then of course fraud. If we can verify the information all along the way and we know that it's been verified along the way. It hasn't been tampered with, which is one of the benefits of blockchain technology. And then perhaps we can alleviate our concerns with this issue associated with food fraud, or at least I can, now that I know too much about it. There are many challenges associated with using these types of applications, however, and basically knowing how to incentivise good behaviour and to stop the bad behaviour is one of the difficulties. And obviously the garbage in, garbage out, you can't stop fraudulent behaviour if people have the ability to tamper with things. But if you make good behaviour more attractive than bad behaviour, then potentially this can be alleviated. And that's one of the challenges to be addressed. There's also challenges associated with the uptake of new technologies. But I just wanted to finish off with one of my favourite quotes that I've found over the time of looking at blockchain technology. Vitalik Buterin was the creator of the Ethereum network, and he's basically said, he's used the term smart contracts. Now this to me meant that I should know how they work and I should understand it all. That's what I thought as a lawyer looking at this term smart contracts. But fortunately he's alleviated my concern by saying he shouldn't have called it that, he should have called it something like persistent scripts, which sounds a lot more computery, and so I'm quite comfortable not knowing exactly how they work. But basically we can program contracts in a way that means that they can execute automatically. But the way that the term smart contracts used when we're talking about blockchain technology basically describes a small program that occurs in the blockchain. So it's kind of an if this, then that occurrence. So you can build a bunch together and make a contract. But fortunately, Vitalik said he should have left the law out of it, even though we're all now involved as lawyers by his use of this word. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry I'm so far over time. But it's such an interesting topic.